Climate pledges are absolutely everywhere these days. But let's be honest, the language can get pretty confusing. So, in this explainer, we're going to decode all that jargon. That way you can tell the difference between a really meaningful promise and, well, just empty words.
Yeah, it feels like a total word salad, right? Net zero, carbon negative, climate neutral, they all sound good, but they definitely do not mean the same thing. And understanding the difference, that's the key to holding companies and governments accountable. So let's sort this whole thing out.
All right, let's start with the big one, net zero. You probably hear this term more than any other, and that's because it's become the central goal for pretty much all global climate action. But what does it actually mean to get there?
So, the core idea of net zero is actually pretty simple. It's all about achieving balance. This is the goal that was set by the Paris Agreement, to stop the planet from heating up any further. Now, it doesn't mean we have to eliminate all emissions tomorrow. What it means is that for every single ton of greenhouse gas we put into the atmosphere, we have to find a way to take 1 ton out.
Okay, so how do we actually achieve that net zero balance? Well, it really comes down to 2 fundamental tools: reductions and removals. They sound kind of similar, I know, but trust me, understanding the difference between them is absolutely critical. I like to think of it like a bathtub that's about to overflow. Reductions are like turning down the faucet. We're putting way less water, or in this case, fewer greenhouse gases, into the system in the first place. Removals, on the other hand, are like opening the drain. We're actively taking out the gases that are already there. The thing is, we have to do both. And here's a perfect way to visualize it. On the left, you've got solar panels. That's a classic example of a GHG reduction. They generate power without creating new emissions that enter the atmosphere. But on the right, this beautiful ecosystem is a GHG removal system. It is actively pulling existing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. See the difference? Okay, now let's dive into all those neutral terms. You see these everywhere, and people often use them like they mean the same thing, but they don't. It's actually better to think of them as a spectrum, with each one representing a little more ambition. So first up, we have carbon neutral. And the key word here is carbon. This is the narrowest of these pledges because it only focuses on balancing out carbon dioxide emissions, and CO2 is just one of several major greenhouse gases. Taking one step up the ambition ladder brings us to GHG neutral. GHG stands for greenhouse gas, of course, and this is much more comprehensive. It means you're balancing all the major greenhouse gases, including really potent ones like methane and nitrous oxide, not just CO2. And right at the top of this neutrality spectrum is climate neutral. This is the big one, the most comprehensive of the 3. It covers all greenhouse gases, but it also includes other human impacts on the climate, things like how changes in land use can affect how much heat the Earth absorbs. It's the whole shebang. But wait, what if we want to go beyond just balancing the scales? What if the goal is something more? Well, that brings us to the most ambitious climate pledges out there. This is absolute zero, sometimes called zero emissions, and it means exactly what it sounds like, eliminating all greenhouse gas emissions from an activity without relying on any offsets or removals to balance the books. This is an incredibly high bar to clear, and for many, it's the ultimate goal. Then you have something called climate positive or net negative. This is when a company or a country goes beyond just balancing its own emissions and actually removes more greenhouse gases from the atmosphere than it emits. In other words, they're cleaning up more than just their own mess, and that helps to reduce the total concentration of GHGs in the air. So we've defined all the different goals, from neutral to positive. But how do organizations actually get there? This brings us to what you might call the Climate Action Toolkit, the specific actions they use to try and meet these pledges. This breaks down 4 of the key actions. Offsetting is the one you've probably heard of most. A company pays for an external project, like protecting a forest somewhere else, to compensate for its own emissions. Insetting is similar, but the project happens within the company's own supply chain, like helping its farmers adopt more sustainable practices. Compensation is really just a broad umbrella term for these kinds of activities. And finally, neutralization is super specific. It means using only carbon removals to balance out any leftover, hard-to-get-rid-of emissions. Now, when we talk about removals, it's not just about planting trees. This chart shows a huge range of what are called carbon dioxide removal, or CDR, methods. They go all the way from natural solutions, like restoring wetlands, to really high-tech approaches like direct air capture, which uses these giant machines to literally suck CO2 out of the air. But the crucial part to look at is at the top,
the time scale of storage. A new forest? It might store carbon for decades, but storing it in geological formations can lock it away for thousands of years. That durability, that's what really determines the quality of the removal.
And that brings us to maybe the most important factor of all, integrity. For any of this to actually work, the numbers have to be trustworthy. A core principle, a kind of golden rule, is that 1 ton of reduced or removed carbon can only be counted once, no double counting. It sounds obvious, but it is the absolute foundation for a credible system.
And this leads to another vital principle called like for like. Think about it for a second. If you're releasing carbon from fossil fuels that's been locked underground for millions of years, does it really make sense to balance that by planting a tree that might only live for 50 or 100 years? The like for like principle says no, it doesn't. Long-lived emissions should be balanced by equally durable long-term removals.
So, what does a credible pathway actually look like? Well, the Oxford Principles give us a fantastic framework. Step 1 is always to reduce your own emissions as much as you possibly can. That's totally non-negotiable. Then, for the emissions you just can't get rid of yet, you compensate for them using high-integrity projects. And over time, the goal is to shift that compensation more and more towards those durable, long-term carbon removals we just talked about.
Whew! We've covered a lot of ground and a lot of terminology, but why is getting this language right so incredibly important?
Because this isn't just jargon. It's not just words. These terms are the building blocks of accountability. Understanding the difference between carbon neutral and climate neutral, or between a temporary removal and a permanent one, that's what lets us look past the marketing slogans. It gives us the tools to tell the difference between a real, solid climate pledge and just clever accounting.
So the next time you see a company or a country make a big climate pledge, you can ask the right questions. Are they really prioritizing deep reductions? Are they using durable, high-quality removals? You can ask yourself, is this just a balancing act? Or is it true ambition? Now, you have the tools to decide.